There is a specific, suffocating silence that follows a lie so massive it briefly breaks your reality. I was waist-deep in a forensic client audit when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I should have let it ring, but instinct is a funny thing. The woman on the line introduced herself as Lauren Hayes from Rocky Summit Realty. Her tone was carefully polite, tiptoeing around a situation she didn't quite understand yet. She just needed to verify a few ownership details, she said, before finalizing the refinance on my mountain cabin in Aspen Ridge. I remember the exact second the air left my lungs. I hadn't applied for a refinance. I hadn't touched the equity on that property. When I stated that fact, the silence on Lauren's end wasn't confusion. It was dread. Then she spoke the words that shattered my world into jagged little pieces. My sister had already confirmed everything. The file was approved. $310,000. The conference room around me dissolved. Because if my name was on a six-figure loan I didn't sign, a line hadn't just been crossed. It had been violently erased. I walked out into the hallway, leaving the meeting behind without a word. I forced my voice to remain perfectly, terrifyingly steady. Address, loan amount, date of submission. I made her repeat every single detail. 489 Aspen Ridge Road, $310,000, filed 2 weeks ago. My cabin. The one I bought at 28, built on the back of double shifts, freelance burnout, and every dime I had ever saved. The same cabin my family had sneered at. My parents had mocked it as playing house in the mountains. Eleanor, my older sister, had practically rolled her eyes, calling it a temporary delusion I'd eventually sell when I woke up to reality. And now she had stolen it. Lauren's voice trembled slightly as she added the final nail to the coffin. The application included a signed family agreement and a notarized document confirming shared ownership between me and my sister. I had never signed a damn thing. I demanded the file. Lauren sent it immediately, her professional facade cracking as she realized she had just stepped into the middle of a felony. 10 minutes later, I was locked inside my car in the parking garage. The engine was dead. My hands were unnervingly still. I opened the PDF. As a financial auditor, I hunt for anomalies. But this was pristine. Every page flawlessly formatted, every box ticked, every signature placed with surgical precision. It wasn't a sloppy, desperate cash grab. It was a masterpiece of fraud. The cabin was no longer mine. The documents framed it as a shared family asset, complete with fabricated payment histories to prove Eleanor's non-existent contributions. It wasn't just a forgery. It was a rewritten history. Then I scrolled to the final page. Sabrina Caldwell, signed in ink. It was a brilliant imitation, close enough to pass a banker's quick glance, but it wasn't mine. The slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen, it lacked the slight, microscopic hesitation my hand always left on the S. It was a clone, copied, pasted, and executed to steal my life's work. Suddenly, my phone lit up, piercing the gloom of the car. A text message. Eleanor. Hey, just checking in. Make sure you're taking care of our cabin, okay? Our cabin. I stared at that 3-letter word until it blurred. The audacity. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of plunging a knife into my back and then asking me to polish the handle. Most people would have shattered right there. They would have called her screaming, demanded answers, threatened the police, and started a chaotic, messy war they weren't prepared to win. But I am an auditor. I have spent my entire career dissecting inconsistencies, tracing hidden money, and destroying liars with paper trails. I know better than anyone that the first emotional reaction is always the weakest move. So I did nothing. I didn't reply to the text. I didn't call the police. I let the forged file sit exactly where it was. I let Eleanor sleep peacefully tonight, entirely convinced that she had won, that I was just the clueless little sister she could easily overwrite. She had built this lie with careful, intricate layers, and I was going to tear every single one of them apart. I didn't confront Eleanor that night. I didn't call my parents, didn't open the file again, didn't even allow myself to replay the phone call more than once. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop closed, staring at my reflection in the dark screen, trying to understand something far more unsettling than the loan itself. When had the story of my life started changing without me noticing? The next morning, I did something simple. I searched my own name alongside the cabin address. At first, everything looked normal. Property records, archived listings from when I first bought the place in 2018, a few photos I had uploaded after finishing the renovations. It was exactly what I expected to see. Then I scrolled further. Eleanor's social media appeared. I hadn't checked it in months, maybe longer. I clicked anyway. The first post that loaded was from 2 winters ago. The cabin, covered in fresh snow, lights glowing from the windows, the exact same angle I had photographed when I first finished installing the new deck. The caption read, "Finally enjoying the family cabin after everything we put into it." I stared at the word "we" longer than I should have. There were dozens of comments underneath, friends congratulating her, relatives saying things like, "So proud of you both," and "Your parents must be so happy you girls did this together." No corrections, no hesitation, just acceptance. I kept scrolling. Another post. Summer this time. A group of people on the deck I built with my own hands, Eleanor standing in the center, glass of wine in her hand, smiling like she belonged there in a way that didn't need explanation. The caption read, "Nothing better than a family investment that actually pays off." Family investment. The comments repeated the same pattern. Reinforcement, validation, a narrative that had already settled into place long before I had noticed it forming. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my eyes still fixed on the screen, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Recognition. Because this wasn't new. Eleanor had always done this. Not through direct lies, not in ways that could easily be challenged, but through something quieter. She let assumptions form and never corrected them. She allowed people to connect dots that didn't belong together until the picture they created felt real enough to stand on its own. A memory surfaced before I could stop it. I was 17, working after school, saving every paycheck. Eleanor was home from college, talking about internships and connections. At a family dinner, my uncle asked who had organized a charity event she mentioned. She smiled, glanced at me for less than a second, and said, "We both helped in different ways." I had built the entire logistics plan for her. She had presented it. Everyone clapped. I remember nodding along, not saying anything. That was the moment silence became part of the system. Back in the present, I opened the refinance file again and reread the so-called family agreement. The language was clean, professional, almost clinical. It didn't sound absurd. That was the problem. It sounded believable, like something that could exist if enough small details had been placed correctly over time. I checked the dates on Eleanor's posts again. 3 years. She hadn't created this narrative overnight. She had been building it slowly, reinforcing it in public spaces where perception becomes reality. By the time the paperwork existed, the idea of shared ownership already felt true to anyone looking from the outside. My phone buzzed. Another message from Eleanor. "Thinking about heading up to the cabin this weekend. You should come. We never spend enough time there together." The timing was too precise to ignore. She was maintaining the story in real time, keeping everything aligned. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed again, then erased that too. Finally, I sent something simple. "Busy this weekend. Maybe next time." There was a pause before her reply came through. "No worries. Just remember, it's not just yours anymore." I read that line slowly. Not just yours anymore. It wasn't framed as a threat. It didn't carry any visible aggression. It was stated like a fact she had already accepted, like something that didn't need to be argued because, in her mind, it had already been decided. That was when the final piece settled into place. This wasn't about a loan. The refinance was just the execution, the visible part of something much deeper. What Eleanor had been building wasn't just a document. It was a version of reality where ownership could be redefined through repetition, through perception, through the quiet agreement of everyone who never questioned it. If enough people believed it, if enough systems accepted it, then eventually the legal truth could be bent to match the social one. I closed the browser and set my phone down on the table. For a long moment, I just sat there, letting everything align in my head. the posts, the comments, the agreement, the timing. None of it was random. None of it was reactive. It was structured. And structures leave patterns. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because the moment I reacted, I would be stepping into a version of the story she had already rehearsed. A version where I looked defensive, emotional, unreasonable. A version she had been preparing for long before I knew there was anything to prepare for. So I chose something else. I chose to stay exactly where I was, quiet and still, watching the shape of it become clearer with every piece I uncovered. Because if Eleanor believed this cabin was already hers, then she wouldn't hide it. She would act like it, and the more she acted, the more she would show me exactly how she planned to take it. I scheduled the appointment at Rocky Summit Realty under the same tone I used for everything else in my life: calm, controlled, nothing that suggested urgency. When I walked into the office in Aspen Ridge, it looked exactly the way a high-end brokerage should look. Glass walls, polished floors, quiet conversations carried at just the right volume. The kind of place that doesn't make mistakes, or at least convinces you it doesn't. Lauren met me at the front desk and led me into a conference room. She didn't try to make small talk this time. Instead, she introduced me to Daniel Pierce, the loan officer who had processed the refinance. He stood when I entered, offered a firm handshake, and smiled in a way that felt practiced. Early 30s, composed, but there was something tight around his eyes, something that told me he was already aware this wasn't a routine meeting. The file was waiting on the table. A manila folder, neatly organized, tabbed, labeled. Not just digital anymore, physical. Something that had moved through hands, through desks, through internal systems without stopping. I sat down, opened it slowly, and let my eyes move across each page without reacting. Everything aligned. Property summary rewritten to suggest shared acquisition. Payment records annotated to imply contributions that didn't exist. A notarized agreement describing the cabin as a family asset managed informally between siblings. It wasn't just a forged document. It was a complete narrative, structured to feel reasonable. I asked Daniel to walk me through the process. He did it smoothly, almost effortlessly. Eleanor had approached the brokerage with a refinance request framed as a family restructuring of assets. She had provided documentation supporting shared ownership. The internal system had reviewed the file. It passed compliance. The refinance was approved. He spoke like someone explaining a finished equation, each step leading logically to the next. I listened, then started asking smaller questions. Not about the outcome, about the steps. When did you verify the primary owner's identity? Did you contact me directly? Did you request original signature validation? Did you confirm the authority described in the agreement? Each question slowed him down just slightly. He admitted he hadn't contacted me directly. The file, he said, included sufficient documentation to proceed without additional verification. That word stayed with me. Sufficient. Not confirmed, not validated, just sufficient. I asked what that meant in practice. He explained that the documentation was consistent, the narrative aligned, and there were no obvious discrepancies requiring escalation. In other words, the story made sense, so he accepted it. I flipped to the notarized document again. The stamp looked legitimate. Clean impression, correct formatting, official seal. But something about it felt too perfect, too uniform, like it had been placed rather than pressed. I didn't say that out loud. Not yet. Instead, I asked about internal checks, secondary review, compliance protocols, automated verification. He explained that high-value refinance applications typically go through both system validation and manual oversight. This file, he said, had passed both stages. No flags, no delays. That was when Lauren placed another set of documents on the table. Internal review notes. I read through them carefully. Daniel's comments described the client as cooperative, the documentation as consistent, the situation as straightforward. There were no indications of doubt, no requests for further verification. Then I reached the last page, an internal email thread, short, casual, almost dismissive. Daniel had written that direct contact with the primary owner might complicate what appeared to be a simple family refinance. The compliance officer had responded with a brief approval, trusting his judgment. I read that line twice. Might complicate. I looked up at him. So you chose not to contact the legal owner because it would complicate the process? I asked. He adjusted his posture slightly, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second before settling again. Based on the documentation provided, it wasn't necessary, he said. The answer sounded weaker the second time. I didn't challenge him further. I didn't need to. I went back to the file, turning each page slowly, not as someone trying to understand what happened, but as someone mapping how it happened. Eleanor didn't just submit false information. She aligned her story with a gap in their process, and Daniel didn't just overlook it. He accepted it, then moved it forward. I asked for copies of everything, every document, every note, every internal communication connected to the file. Lauren didn't hesitate this time. She gathered the materials, printed what needed to be printed, and handed them over with a seriousness that hadn't been there before. As I stood to leave, I felt that same cold clarity settle in again, because the file had answered one question, but it had opened another. This didn't move too fast, it moved too smoothly, and systems like this don't fail cleanly unless someone shows them exactly where to bend. I didn't call Eleanor after leaving the brokerage, and I didn't open the file again that night. I followed my routine exactly as if nothing had changed. I answered emails, returned client calls, even accepted a video chat from my parents, and listened to them talk about weather and weekend plans like the last 24 hours hadn't happened. If anyone had been watching me, they would have seen nothing out of place. That was the point. The next morning, I sat across from Rachel Green, a financial fraud attorney whose name I had pulled from a quiet recommendation list, the kind people share when they don't want attention. I didn't explain everything emotionally. I placed the file on her desk and walked her through the timeline in a steady voice, then stopped talking. She read without interruption, her eyes moving quickly but precisely across each page. When she finished, she didn't look surprised. She looked focused. "This isn't just forgery," she said. "This is structured misrepresentation." The distinction mattered. We brought in a forensic document examiner 2 days later. Victor Hale arrived with a small case and the kind of calm presence that suggested he didn't deal in guesses. He asked for my original documents first, not the refinance file. Then he placed them side by side, comparing details I had only felt instinctively before. Stroke pressure, pen lift, the way certain letters curved under hesitation. He pointed to the signature on the refinance agreement and shook his head slightly. "This wasn't drawn," he said. "It was extracted." I didn't ask what he meant. He explained anyway. The signature had been lifted from a scanned version of a previous document, cleaned digitally, then reinserted into the agreement before being printed and processed as if it were original. It wasn't imitation. It was replication. At the same time, Rachel requested access to the document metadata through a formal inquiry to the brokerage. It took less than 48 hours for the files to come through. We reviewed them together in her office, the three of us leaning over a screen as the timestamps loaded. The narrative in the files suggested years of shared ownership. The data told a different story. The family agreement, the notarized statement, and several supporting documents had all been created within a narrow window, minutes apart, not over time, not gradually, one session, controlled, intentional. Rachel zoomed in on the origin trace. The files hadn't been created from Eleanor's home system. They had been generated from an IP address tied to a commercial network, the Brokerage. I didn't react immediately. I just sat there, watching the pattern settle into something clearer. Eleanor hadn't just built a story. She had been guided through the process by someone who understood exactly how to move that story through a system without triggering resistance. I kept responding to her messages like nothing had changed. When she asked if I wanted to come up to the cabin that weekend, I told her I was busy. When she mentioned inviting friends, I told her to enjoy it. Every reply was short, neutral, unremarkable, but I started listening more carefully, paying attention to what she said without realizing it mattered. Then she sent a voice message. "I talked to someone about the paperwork," she said casually. "Everything's already in place, so it should go through smoothly. You don't need to worry about anything." I listened to it 3 times. Not for what she said, for how she said it. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She wasn't hoping this would work. She expected it to. I forwarded the message to Rachel. By the end of the week, we had built the first real version of what she called a pattern map. Not just isolated pieces of evidence, but connections. Eleanor's public narrative, the fabricated documents, the replicated signature, the internal email suggesting deliberate avoidance of verification, the metadata linking document creation back to the brokerage system. It wasn't complete yet, but it was enough to understand intent. Rachel leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. "You need to understand something," she said. "If this goes where I think it's going, this won't stay civil." I nodded once. Because somewhere between the signature and the metadata, the nature of the situation had already changed. This wasn't just my sister trying to take something from me. This was someone showing her exactly how to do it. And the more I stayed quiet, the more they would keep moving, thinking nothing was wrong, thinking the structure they built was holding. That was the part they didn't understand. Structures don't collapse when you push them. They collapse when you expose how they were built. I didn't expect to find anyone else, but Rachel did. She said people who get away with something once don't stop, they refine it. And that meant we weren't just looking at what Eleanor had done to me, we were looking for where the pattern had already existed. The connection came from a name buried deep inside the brokerage's internal system, another refinance request that had been flagged months earlier and then quietly withdrawn before approval. No escalation, no report, just gone. Rachel tracked the owner down anyway. Her name was Denise Walker. We met her 2 days later in a small cafe halfway between her town and Aspen Ridge. She arrived early, already seated, a worn folder resting on the table in front of her like something she had picked up and put down too many times without knowing what to do with it. When Rachel introduced me, Denise gave a small nod, then opened the folder without being asked. Inside were documents that felt disturbingly familiar. Same structure, same language, same type of family agreement claiming shared ownership. Even the signature looked like mine at first glance, except it wasn't her real signature either. It had the same subtle flaws, the same unnatural consistency that Victor had pointed out in my case. I didn't need him there to recognize it now. Denise told us she had never authorized any refinance. Her brother had submitted the application. It had almost gone through. Something in her file triggered a final review, something small, something procedural, and the process stopped just before approval. No investigation followed, no charges. The brokerage simply marked it as incomplete and moved on. "Why didn't you push it further?" Rachel asked. Denise hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the folder. "It was my brother," she said quietly. "I didn't want to destroy the family over something that didn't happen." I understood that instinct immediately. Contain the damage, keep it quiet, protect the structure, even if the structure was what caused the problem in the first place. We compared timelines. Denise's case had been processed by the same loan officer, Daniel Pierce. Same approach, same justification, informal family ownership, no direct verification of the legal owner, no escalation. It wasn't coincidence anymore. It was a method. Back in Rachel's office, the pattern map expanded across the whiteboard behind her desk. My case, Denise's case, 2 properties, 2 siblings acting as the entry point. One loan officer moving both files forward using the same reasoning, the same gaps in the system. It wasn't large-scale fraud in the way people imagined, no mass operations, no wide networks. It was controlled, targeted, built on relationships that wouldn't immediately raise suspicion. That was when the brokerage initiated an internal audit. Lauren called me directly this time. There was no hesitation in her voice now, no careful distance. "We've placed Daniel on temporary suspension pending review," she said. She didn't mention my name or Denise's, but she didn't need to. The shift had already begun. At the same time, Eleanor's behavior changed. Her messages became more frequent, more deliberate, less casual. She stopped checking in and started suggesting. "We should really formalize everything," she wrote one evening. "It'll make things easier long term." I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit. Then another one came. There's a document I can send you. Just to clean things up. Clean things up. That was the first time she tried to pull me into the structure after it had already been built. I told Rachel immediately. If she sends anything, we document it, she said. If she calls, you answer, but you don't challenge her. You let her talk. The call came the next night. I answered on the second ring, keeping my voice neutral, steady. I think there's been some confusion about the cabin, Eleanor said, her tone controlled, almost careful. But it's nothing we can't fix. We just need to align everything legally. I asked her what she meant. There was a brief pause, just enough to suggest she was choosing her words. There's already a structure in place, she said. We just need your signature to finalize it properly. There it was. Not denial, adjustment. I let her keep talking. I asked simple questions. When was this structure created? Who helped her with it? Why hadn't she mentioned it before? Her answers started vague, then became more specific without her noticing. She referenced guidance, someone who understood the process, someone who knew how to make everything clean. That word again. Clean. I ended the call with something neutral. Send me what you have, I said. I'll take a look. When the line went quiet, I didn't move right away. I just sat there, replaying her voice in my head. Not what she said, but how certain she sounded. Like someone who had already done this once and expected it to work again. Rachel had recorded everything. The next morning, she was already listening to the call again, marking timestamps, isolating key phrases. This confirms intent, she said, not just belief, participation. By the end of that day, the situation had shifted again. This wasn't just about stopping a refinance. It wasn't even just about proving ownership. It was about exposing a process that had already worked once, almost worked twice, and would keep working as long as no one forced it into the open. And for the first time, I understood exactly where this was heading. Not to a quiet resolution, but to a place where everything would have to be said out loud. The hearing was scheduled as a civil dispute, exactly the way Eleanor wanted it framed, a disagreement between siblings over how a property had been understood rather than what had actually happened. That framing alone told me how confident she was, because if it stayed civil, it would become a negotiation, and negotiations reward the person who controls the narrative. I arrived early with Rachel, carrying only a thin folder. Everything else was already prepared, structured, and waiting. The room was smaller than I expected. Not a dramatic courtroom, but a formal hearing space where quiet decisions carried real weight. Neutral walls, controlled lighting, a handful of observers who thought they were about to witness something routine. Eleanor entered 10 minutes later. She looked composed, more than composed, like someone stepping into a role she had rehearsed. Soft, neutral tones, minimal jewelry, nothing that could be read as aggressive or defensive. When she saw me, she smiled slightly, the kind of expression that suggested we were about to settle something small and manageable. Daniel was there too, seated just behind her legal counsel, posture straight, expression controlled. He wasn't distancing himself from the situation, he was still inside it. The hearing began with Eleanor's attorney presenting their version of events. Calm, structured, persuasive. They framed the cabin as an informal family asset, something built and maintained through shared effort, even if the legal documentation hadn't fully reflected that reality. They referenced the family agreement, the consistent use of the property by multiple people, the public narrative that had existed for years. They introduced selected messages, carefully edited to support the idea that I had acknowledged shared responsibility at some point. From the outside, it worked. The story was clean, consistent, built to feel reasonable. Eleanor spoke next. Her voice was steady, controlled, just enough emotion to feel authentic without losing composure. She described how she had always believed the cabin was something we shared, how the refinance was meant to unlock value for the family, how she had been surprised by my reaction. She didn't accuse me directly. She didn't raise her voice. She positioned herself as someone caught in a misunderstanding that had escalated unnecessarily. At one point, she looked directly at me. "I thought we were on the same page," she said. The line landed exactly where she intended it to. Daniel's attorney followed. They acknowledged procedural imperfections but framed them as reasonable judgment calls. They emphasized that the documentation provided had appeared consistent, that no obvious red flags had been present, that the decision not to contact me directly was based on efficiency rather than intent. It was careful, measured, designed to admit just enough without conceding anything that suggested deliberate wrongdoing. For a moment, it felt like everything was aligning in their favor. Rachel didn't move until they finished. When she stood, she didn't raise her voice or change the tone of the room. She simply redirected it. "We agree that this case involves a narrative," she began. "The difference is that we can show exactly how that narrative was constructed." She didn't start with the signature. She started with time. A timeline appeared on the screen behind her, mapping Eleanor's public posts, internal document creation timestamps, and the sequence of file submissions. At first glance, it looked like a standard presentation, but as she walked through it, the inconsistencies began to surface. Documents that were supposed to represent years of shared ownership had been created within a single short window. Posts suggesting long-term collaboration appeared only after key milestones had already been completed by me alone. The room grew quieter. Rachel shifted to process. She asked Daniel to confirm whether he had ever directly contacted the legal owner of the property. "No," he said. She asked whether he had independently verified the authenticity of the signature. "No." Each answer seemed small on its own, but together they formed something harder to ignore. Eleanor's attorney attempted to redirect, emphasizing intention over procedure, but Rachel didn't follow. She stayed on structure, on sequence, on the difference between what was claimed and what could actually be proven. Then she paused. Not for effect, for transition. "Before we proceed further," she said, "we would like to submit additional evidence addressing both authorship and origin of the documents in question." Something shifted in the room. Up to that point, it had still felt like a disagreement, something that could be argued, reframed, negotiated. But the way Rachel said it made one thing clear. This wasn't about interpretation anymore, and whatever came next wasn't going to fit inside the version of the story Eleanor had built. Rachel didn't rush the next part, and that was what made it land. She let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to feel the shift, then introduced Victor Hale, the forensic document examiner. He stepped forward with nothing more than a slim folder, no performance, no build-up, just precision. He started with the signatures. On the screen, my original signature appeared beside the one from the refinance agreement. At first glance, they looked close enough, similar structure, similar flow, the kind of match that would pass in a quick review. But Victor didn't talk about how they looked. He talked about how they were made. He pointed out inconsistencies in pressure, the unnatural uniformity in stroke thickness, the absence of micro-hesitation where my hand always slowed. Then he said something that changed the room. "This was not drawn," he said. "It was extracted." Eleanor's attorney objected immediately, questioning methodology, but Victor continued without raising his voice. He referenced a scanned document from years earlier that contained my real signature. He demonstrated how specific elements had been lifted, cleaned, and reinserted into the refinance file. It wasn't a guess. It was traceable. The signature wasn't an imitation. It was a copy. Rachel didn't pause. She introduced the digital forensic analyst next. A new set of data filled the screen: metadata logs, creation timestamps, device origins. The analyst walked through each element with calm clarity. The so-called family agreement, the notarized statement, and the supporting documents had all been created within a narrow window, minutes apart, not over years as the narrative suggested. More importantly, the origin trace pointed to a system connected to the brokerage's internal network. That was when Daniel shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight adjustment in posture, a tightening in his expression that hadn't been there before. Rachel turned toward him for the first time. "Mr. Pierce, can you confirm whether you had access to the system from which these documents originated?" she asked. He hesitated, only for a second. "Yes," he said. The room tightened around that word. Rachel introduced the internal email next, projecting it clearly. Daniel's own message about avoiding direct contact with the property owner. his justification that verification might complicate the process, the response from compliance approving his decision. It wasn't framed, it wasn't interpreted, it was simply shown. Eleanor's attorney tried to interrupt, to contextualize, to reframe, but there was nothing to reframe. The words were already complete. Then Rachel moved to the final piece, the recording. She asked for permission, and once granted, Eleanor's voice filled the room. Calm, certain, unaware. "Everything's already in place. We just need your signature to finalize it properly." The words didn't need explanation. They didn't need interpretation. They stood on their own. Eleanor's expression changed. Not all at once, but enough. The control slipped. Rachel paused the recording at the exact moment Eleanor referenced guidance. She turned slightly, her gaze settling on Daniel again. "Would you like to explain what guidance was provided?" she asked. He didn't answer. His attorney leaned in, speaking quietly, urgently. But it didn't matter, because by then the structure was complete. The signature proved false authorship. The metadata proved controlled fabrication. The internal email proved deliberate avoidance. The recording proved coordination. It wasn't one mistake. It was a system. The judge called for a brief recess. When the hearing resumed, the tone had changed completely. What had started as a civil dispute no longer fit inside that category. The judge's voice was steady, measured, but final. "The evidence presented indicates potential criminal conduct," she said. "This matter will be referred for further investigation." Eleanor didn't speak. Daniel didn't either. For the first time since this began, neither of them had anything left to stand on. No narrative to shape, no version to defend, just evidence that didn't require their explanation. The hearing ended without the resolution they expected. No settlement, no negotiation, just a shift from one system into another. People began to stand, gathering their things, voices low, movements controlled, as if everyone understood they had just watched something change direction in real time. I remained seated for a moment longer, not because I needed to process what had happened, but because I understood what it meant. This wasn't the end. It was the point where everything moved beyond them. And for the first time since that call, I felt something different. Not tension, not anger, just the quiet certainty that whatever came next would no longer depend on what they said, only on what they had done. I didn't stay to watch what happened after the hearing ended, because by the time the judge referred the case for criminal investigation, everything that needed to collapse had already collapsed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, irreversible way things fall apart when they can no longer hold their shape under truth. The drive back to Aspen Ridge felt different than any drive I had taken before. Snow had started falling again, light at first, then steady, covering the road in a clean, uninterrupted layer. I had driven this route so many times over the years, usually thinking about deadlines, client work, the next thing I needed to solve. This time, there was nothing to solve. The outcome was already moving forward without me. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly the same. Same structure, same wood, same quiet presence against the mountains. Nothing about it reflected what had just happened in that room, and somehow that was the most grounding part. Because everything Eleanor had tried to change existed only in documents and perception, the reality had never moved. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Cold air met me first, still and untouched. I set my bag down, walked straight to the fireplace, and started a fire the way I always did. Slow, methodical, wood stacked carefully, flame built deliberately. There was something about that process that reminded me of everything I had done to build this place in the first place. No shortcuts, no borrowed effort, just time and work that couldn't be rewritten by anyone else. I didn't check my phone for a while. When I finally did, there were messages waiting. Rachel had sent a brief update confirming that the case had officially been escalated, that the brokerage was cooperating fully, that Daniel's license was under immediate review. There would be compliance audits, restitution discussions, external investigations, systems activating one after another now that everything had been exposed. There was also a message from Eleanor. It was shorter than anything she had ever sent me. I didn't think it would go this far. I read it once, then locked my phone and set it aside. Because that sentence wasn't regret. It wasn't even an apology. It was an expectation that had failed. She thought it would stay controlled, contained, something she could adjust if needed. It didn't. I walked over to the wall where I kept the original deed, framed simply in wood. My name was there, exactly as it had always been, not copied, not altered, not interpreted, just mine. For a long time, I had treated that document as proof, something external that validated what I had built. But standing there now, I understood something different. The proof had never been the paper. It had been the work, the time, the fact that I built something that didn't depend on anyone else's version of reality to exist. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering everything evenly without asking permission. Inside, the fire settled into a quiet burn, the kind that doesn't demand attention but changes the entire room. I sat down and let the silence settle around me. Not the kind of silence that comes from avoidance, but the kind that comes after everything unnecessary has been stripped away. No arguments left. No explanations needed. No version of events that required me to defend what was already true. They didn't take anything from me. They revealed exactly who they were. And in doing that, they gave me something I didn't realize I was still holding on to. The need to explain myself. The need to justify what was mine. The need to keep the peace at my own expense. That was gone now. I leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire fill the space, and for the first time since that call, I allowed myself to do nothing at all. No planning, no anticipation, just presence, because everything that mattered was already here. If you've ever had something you built questioned, minimized, or quietly taken in ways that didn't feel obvious at first, you probably understand that moment when it finally becomes clear. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. So I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have confronted it the moment you found out? Or would you have done what I did and stayed silent long enough to see the full picture before making a move? Let me know what you think in the comments, because I read every one of them. And if stories like this resonate with you, if you believe in boundaries that don't need to be explained and truth that doesn't need to be defended, stay here with me and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this. And sometimes, the most powerful ones aren't about fighting back. They're about knowing exactly when to stop letting anyone else rewrite your life. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.